We want to take you now to another part of West Block. I said off the beginning of the show there that NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman is taking questions from a committee of MPs. They're asking him about the link between concussions and the sport, the sport obviously of hockey. He's the commissioner of the NHL. Let's take a listen into those proceedings right now.
In the league that leaves players open to brain damage, mental illness, substance abuse, and he connected many of these issues to head trauma suffered in fights. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to a player that says that, who's
they're on this whole topic, and as this dialogue is making clear, there's no shortage of opinions on this subject. So the good news from your standpoint is that as the game has evolved to a skill game, and we don't have the bench clearing brawls of decades ago, and we don't have third man in, and there's an instigator rule that precedes me, and there's less and less fighting than we've been, not because of some edict, but because of the way the game is now being played. That is a more organic way of dealing with the evolution of the game. But whether it's the OHL, the WHL, the QMJHL, the USHL, the AHL, the ECHL, we have less incidents of fighting than any of those leagues. So if you're looking for us to be setting an example, the fact of the matter is we have less fighting.
Well, you should have none. Quite frankly, it is still dangerous.
But you and I don't know the consequences of that. And when they polled the players a few years ago, 98% of the players they polled said they didn't want the rule changed. And in fact, there have been a number of...
If I may interrupt, because I'm running out of time. Thank you.
We're moving over to the Conservatives and Dr. Kitchen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
This is the lightning round.
And appreciate it. I can actually, my next question to you, for Prun, I was asked you earlier about referees, was to deal with the issues of consistency.
Yeah.
And oftentimes consistency makes a huge difference in how players react and how coaches, et cetera, react to things. And I'm just wondering how you might respond onto what steps do you take when you see something that appears to be retaliatory? So I was involved at McGill University playing rugby. The women's rugby team there that I helped out, they had memories that remembered the last time they played a person, and they would bring it out right like that. But hockey players are the same way, and they remember things. And so, for example, just recently there was a game where there was a hit to the head. The player was out for 3 games. There was a suspension. That person came back and then retaliated with a fight, and the suspension that he got was not even close to what was done in the initial. And I'm just wondering, how do we keep that consistency, and especially when minor leagues are looking to seeing what the NHL is doing?
The beauty of having the resources we have and the Department of Player Safety led by former players, they know everything that's going on in the game. And if there's an act that transcends the rules that we believe is an act of retaliation, it gets dealt with appropriately. And if we suspect, because of public statements or whatever, that there's going to be an act of retaliation, the clubs and the players are warned in advance. So that is absolutely critical to us monitoring everything that's going on in the game. With respect to fighting, nobody has to fight. Okay, the game has also evolved in that way. If you decide you don't want to fight, you can walk away from a fight. You don't have to do it. And if, in fact, somebody tries to fight you and you're not fighting back, there's a penalty for that, and the officials take care of it. So I would say probably 75 or 76% of our players never engage in a fight. To the extent that do, maybe it's 1 fight a season. So the involvement in lots of players having lots of fight, that's from a different bygone era. And the culture is now, if you choose not to fight, you don't have to.
30 seconds.
So that's okay.
Okay, so we're going to move over to Ms. Hardcastle from the NDP for 3 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so you really believe that I guess there's going to be this organic reduction in fighting, and this is going to be okay without any rule changes? At what point do you think that rule that some rule changes are going to have to be established, like a new framework?
We're constantly monitoring and evolving. We meet with the general managers on a regular basis to go over what's taking place in the game. Because we're watching every game, we're looking at trends. But the organic change that we've seen is you don't see staged fights anymore. Okay? We actually proposed a rule a number of years ago to get rid of staged fights, and the Players Association said no. But it evolved out of the game because as we moved the game to skill, and teams decided it was more important to have 4 skilled lines than to have a designated tough guy, the amount of fighting came down. The type of fighting you see now, for the most part, is an emotional, in-the-moment act. Somebody's upset, aggravated about something. We have a very fast-paced, emotional game with a lot of physical contact. That is an outlet that is probably better than some other outlets. But again, it has become an increasingly less important part of the game.
And how often do you review the science and the research and a concussion protocol? Because I noticed you mentioned, you referenced the Berlin Consensus, but it actually, the research is actually there and more understood. And I think the protocol that you're using isn't as up to date as the Berlin Protocol. Do you have a committee?
We have a concussion subcommittee, meets 4 times a year. We have outside experts who are retained. I think there were 36 experts, medicine, scientific, who signed on to the Berlin statement, the consensus statement. We probably have 3 or 4 or 5 people involved in that. Obviously, we don't control it, but we're involved, and we're constantly looking and evaluating and reevaluating how it's all working.
Thank you. This moves us to our last questioner. It's MP Maloney from the Liberals.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I'll try to be quick again. Look, this fighting debate, from where I sit, it's an evolution. You've got, it's part fan interest and part medical. I mean, there's fans that still like fighting in the game. Players agree with what you've said. That it's a mechanism to control other issues on the ice. Doug Gilmour was once quoted as saying, "If you ban fighting, I'll be the toughest guy in the NHL." That's the mentality of the players. But let's move on from that. So I just want to pick up on the equipment issue. Do you think that there are further changes that could be made to improve the equipment that would reduce the number of head injuries? And then my second question, and I'll leave the floor to you, is forget about collective bargaining. The two of you get to decide what happens. What changes would you make to the game to improve it in a way that would reduce the number of concussions and head-related injuries?
We have also a subcommittee on protective equipment, and that meets on a regular basis, and that's something we're constantly evaluating. I know a lot of people talk about head helmets. Concussions and helmets, 2 different things, because the concussion is what happens inside. The helmet keeps you from getting a cracked skull, but it doesn't necessarily stop a concussion. But we have subcommittees that meet on a regular basis to deal and look at equipment and what changes are appropriate, and that's something that we continue. All of these things that relate to the game, they're not one-offs. This is a constant effort where personnel, time, energy, money is spent to continuously evaluate what's going on in the game and to make the best judgments for the game.
And my second question is, what would you do, you and the deputy commissioner, if you had carte blanche to make any changes to the game right now?
I like the way the game's being played right now.
That would improve it in a way that would reduce the number of head injuries.
Right now, I don't believe there's much we could do. Just to give you an indication on this, I was on a campaign to get visors. Eyes don't heal particularly well, and they also reduce the incidence of fighting. It took me 20 years to get the Players Association to agree to put visors on.
Yeah, and they were grandfathered in when they were. No.
Well, but now virtually 95% of our players
I see the
are
legs
wearing
going.
them.
I just, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank Commissioner Bettman, Deputy Commissioner Daly.
That was NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman testifying before a committee of MPs earlier this afternoon. He faced questions about the issue of concussions in hockey and whether the government should be doing anything about sports-related head injuries. Bettman was also asked what he and the NHL could do. He said it would be impossible to ban all hits to the head in the NHL and maintain the physical element of professional hockey. Here to discuss his testimony, I'm joined from the foyer of the House of Commons by Pam Damoff, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health, Robert Kitchen, the Conservative youth critic, and Cheryl Hardcastle, the NDP's sports critic. Hello to all three of you. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Ms. Damoff, I'll start with you, and I'll pick up on that clip of Gary Bettman. He essentially was saying that he has not seen any conclusive evidence that links sports-related concussions to the presence of CTE. What did you think of that when he said that?
Well, I mean, it's he said that before, and that's his testimony. The committee has heard conflicting evidence, so I think the committee will come up with their recommendations based on what the total of the evidence that they've heard.
What do you think so far? I mean, you've been studying this for months now. Based on the totality of the evidence that you've heard so far, is there enough to convince you there is a link?
Well, I personally think that, you know, many sports organizations have found that there's a link, and you look at some of the sports individuals who have had their brains examined. But I want to leave it up to the committee to do their report and do the work. I'm not going to be involved in the report writing. I'm not a member of the subcommittee, so I don't want to prejudge what they're going to do.
Okay, Mr. Kitchen, let me ask you the same question. Based on the evidence that the committee has heard so far, do you think there's a link?
Well, I think a lot of the evidence that we've heard throughout the whole committee was to look at the issue of concussion in sports in general. Today's testimony by Mr. Bettman, although he touched on the link between, or talked about concussions and CTE, this study wasn't designed to look at that evidence. That evidence is scientific in background, and we didn't go into that same depth with the research that we did with this committee.
So what are the implications then for what the committee produces in the end? Because it's my understanding that that link would obviously sort of help determine what kind of action, if any, should come from the outside of these sports organizations, whether that be the government or otherwise.
Well, you're right in the aspect that it should be looked at from the outside and what the sport bodies are doing. And the sporting bodies need to step up and do their proper due diligence to make certain that they study and investigate the issue on how it pertains to that sport in particular. But for us as a committee, we sat down, we listened to different sporting organizations, and we look forward to compiling that information to provide us with hopefully some good recommendations out of this.
So what kind of recommendations would that involve then, Ms. Hardcastle?
Yes, I think obviously a national strategy is needed for the diagnosis and treatment and prevention for this issue. It is emerging. This is something that we're learning more and more about, and the science is there enough for this committee to be struck. I have to say, one of the reasons that we had vanguard leaders and scientists in the research of concussion and brain injury in sports specifically is we had them come together to testify at this committee because there is merit for it. So the role of the government, and what we're seeing and what we've been hearing, is when you have a national strategy to ensure that you have equal access whether you live in an urban area or a remote area or a rural area. You need some kind of a protocol in place, and that you cannot leave minor organizations that are dealing with children, and they're mostly volunteers. You can't leave the onus up to them. There has to be some form of support there. So I think that's what we've heard and what we're going to be able to flesh out as we're drafting our recommendations together as a committee.
I guess what I'm unclear on, Ms. Hardcastle, though, is if the evidence, as your two colleagues say, is mixed as to the link between, let's say, CTE and concussions, which is, I mean, the reason people are worried about the effect of concussions is because the presence of CTE has been found by researchers in professional athletes who lost their lives.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think that it's an emerging issue. Okay, this is all of the issues around concussion are emerging. We have seen enough links that we are interested as a subcommittee to be studying the whole issue of concussions, because there are other symptoms as well. that come from brain injury and repetitive brain injury. So the onus is not to just be on us saying yes or no, but to say, how do we fill in now these research gaps, and how do we create this really meaningful strategy? It's not to say that it's inconclusive now, it's helping us learn more and more about what else happens as you have repetitive injuries. So the science, how do we support more science, more research to target a decisive answer?
So, Ms. Damoff, would that be the sort of purpose of the recommendations, whatever comes of this subcommittee, to sort of gear a strategy, as Ms. Hardcastle says, towards more research and maybe rules around or some sort of support for minor leagues? I ask because, of course, we're hearing from Mr. Bettman, who represents a major league.
Right, and I think what my colleague said is really important to remember, because this study is not looking at a connection between concussions and CTE, but rather the focus of this study, which started in October, was to look at concussions in sport, and particularly in youth. So I think it's important to look at what the government's doing, which has been investing through Parachute for education and awareness in minor leagues. Just recently, in the last budget, there was $1 million to work with groups like Holland Bloorview to help kids get back to school after a concussion. So there's a lot of work that's being done, and certainly the work of this committee will inform that. But you need to look at what the mandate of this committee was, which was really to look at concussions in sport and with a particular focus on youth. So
if that's the case, Mr. Kitchen, what was the point of hearing from Mr. Bettman?
Well, he brings a different aspect to it. He brings a professional point of view, and as we've heard many times throughout the committee, a lot of the athletes that we have, when we take it from, as we like to say, from the playground up to our premier athletes, they're starting at the base, and they're looking at these professional athletes, our Olympians, our Paralympians that are out there doing things, and they're emulating them and trying to live up to those standards. And that reflects down into those lower levels. So we want to make certain in the committee that we're taking all actions that trickle down to the playground, to the minor hockeys, to the minor soccer leagues. And how can we do things, and what steps can we take to make certain that we're doing everything we can as a government to make certain that our children are protected, our parents are protected, our coaches are protected, and they're educated on this aspect of it, because the education is slowly getting out there. It needs to get out there faster, but we want to see that so that we can advance. And really, as I said to Mr. Bettman today, what's it going to look like 26 years from now?
He didn't really have an answer, though. He didn't think the game could be improved. Do you agree with him?
He basically talked about the NHL as it stands with the NHL, but he did tell us that throughout the time that they are continually reevaluating what's going on. They're continually reassessing the protocols that they have on their concussion protocols and their screening, et cetera. And as he indicated, 3 years ago, they didn't have spotters watching things in the hockey in NHL. So those are good steps. It's an evolving process. We need to continue to see it evolve.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Hardcastle, but your follow-up question to that in the committee was a question to Mr. Bettman, sort of saying, do you expect then just organically the risk for concussions to decrease? And what did you think of his answer?
I can't recall verbatim his answer to that specifically, but when I was asking that question, I think the answer and the response has been fairly consistent from Mr. Bettman, and it's very clear that the onus to take the lead on this issue is not going to be on the NHL under Mr. Bettman. They are waiting to have more evidence brought to them, obviously. And
what do you think of that?
That's informative as a committee. That's informative to me as a committee, knowing now how do I formulate my recommendations and my focus now. This is about people. Athletes are devastated, they're affected by concussion, and so are their families. And I don't care what age they are, and I want to be able to articulate recommendations. And I can say that at least we heard very loud and clear. Mr. Bettman spoke with a lot of candor about where he feels the NHL is in the status quo. So I had to respect that stance, and now I know how I can advocate on the committee for effective and responsive recommendations.
I guess my question to all three of you, though, is that stance right or wrong? What do you think?
Well, if I can just say, I think this is a very interesting point that we're at with regards to concussion and research. It's no longer about opinion. We've got enough information to help us make choices, informed choices. It's no longer about opinions and beliefs. It's about choices and a path forward. And when we don't have information, we can even articulate that in a recommendation. Let's research more decisive information about this issue. Let's figure out, Mr. Bettman told us, it's very hard for them to share data for a lot of proprietary reasons. Is there a role for the government in that? So there are ways we can move forward.
Yeah, and I guess my point, Ms. Damoff, is I'm not asking for opinions. I mean, there are NHL players who are suing the NHL for what they consider negligence on this issue. This isn't innocuous, right? This isn't just asking, you've been listening to the testimony. Mr. Bettman made his point clear. The NHL is not going to change its policies in any way whatsoever. He does not think the game could be improved so as to reduce the risk of concussions. Do you think that's right or wrong?
Well, I think my colleague, Ms. Hardcastle, actually said it really well. I mean, we need to be looking at evidence. We certainly are a government that like to make evidence-based decisions, and I think that's why we're investing in research. Let's get the evidence that we need, and if that's what Mr. Bettman needs, then that we need to be investing in research on concussions. But I think the focus for all of us, this isn't a partisan issue. We want to keep Canadians safe. And we want to keep youth safe when they're playing sports. We want to encourage them to be playing sports. We don't want parents to be fearful and taking their kids out of sports because of the fear of them getting a concussion or a head injury.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but I really appreciate all your time today. Thank you so much to Pam Damoff, Robert Kitchen, and Cheryl Hardcastle.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.